Alright everyone, I think we need to talk about the mk5 Mondeo power steering racks again. Let me put it this way, in all the company cars that we've had here, I have only ever, well this is from 2015 until now, which is Christmas Eve 2019, I've only ever had one problem with a power steering rack. They're not actually, I don't know if you'd call them power steering racks, they're electric racks, which is the steering rack on these cars has an electric motor on them. There's no oil or fluid that goes into them at all. They are a sealed unit for life. But anyway, in all the cars we've ever had here, all the company taxis, we've only ever had one steering rack go faulty, and that was down to a faulty ECU not communicating with the engine ECU and whatever, and it stopped the power steering from working. Since then, we've had a few developments, and I think I should bring this point up because it's been a big thing in America. In America and Canada, there was a massive recall on Ford Fusions and Ford Edges and the like. The actual electric motor on these power steering racks have been breaking, and literally the bolts that hold the motor to the rack have been corroding and breaking. And in the worst case scenario, the motor actually falls off the rack. And I'll come to that in a minute because I've had that here. In the last 6 months, we've had a few odd cars here, you should say. They're like mk5 Mondeos that have been bought, not to be used as company cars, but to be made into a hackney and sold to owner drivers. So they're not going to actually be company cars. But now, in 2 of these cases, I've had problems with the steering racks, and they're all 15 plates, by the way. It seems to be something to do with 15 plate, although in America it was from 2013 to 2015 there was the problem. But the first problem I encountered here was a 15 plate, the actual steering, and this was really bad. The steering, you couldn't turn at all. You could get hold of that steering wheel, and no matter how much you tried to turn the steering wheel, it was absolutely locked solid. It took about 10 people to move the car and get it on the ramp. And the motor had actually fallen off the rack. All 3 bolts that hold the motor onto the steering rack had broke off, and the motor was just sitting beside the steering rack. And the thing is, when these, I'll show you this in a minute, but when these motors if you remove a motor from a rack, from one of these racks, you should still be able to steer the car. In this particular case, the rack was locked up solid. The reason being, there's a little belt drive inside these racks, and it was broken. So that had snapped for some reason, and it had got chewed up inside the mechanism, and it had literally locked the rack solid. So if you were driving that car, I don't know about this car, where it was recovered from. It came from an auction or somewhere, as with the steering locked. I think the boss got it cheap. So I don't actually know what happened to it or whether it's being driven at the time. But if you were driving that car at the time and that steering locked up like that, that means you couldn't steer at all. That's really dangerous. In any other case, the case of this particular car here, he just lost his steering. It just went, the actual power steering stopped working. The steering was just heavy, which, you know, fair enough, you can still steer it when it's heavy. It just resorts back to a manual steering rack. But in this particular case here, 2 of the 3 bolts that hold the motor on had snapped. And I got this car back here, there was no power steering at all. I put our diagnostic tool onto it, and there were a few codes basically reading ESC light was on. There were a few codes relating to some kind of motor resistance. So and I'll show you this in a minute, the motor had actually tipped. So I guess the motor was dragging or something, and the ECU had realised this and flung up a fault code, and it had stopped the power steering from working. Now this actual motor was close to falling off. I cleared the codes, and all of a sudden, once I cleared the codes, the power steering was working again. So I thought, maybe that's the problem solved, maybe it was a glitch. But I thought, no, let me have a look around, because I knew about these bolts anyway. I thought I'd have a look around, couldn't see no wiring problems. When I looked up underneath the car at the rack, I could literally see the motor was actually separating from the steering rack. So I've had to change the steering rack itself. And I'm going to show you this old rack now, because This situation is quite dodgy. It's one thing for the motor to stop working or to fall off, to even fall off the rack, but for it to for the actual rack to seize up so you can't turn the steering, that could be a serious issue. I tried having a word with Ford and I was getting like, no one really knew what was going on. So I don't think in the UK it's a recall or anything. No, all I was getting was blank answers down Ford. But obviously in America it was a big problem and they were replacing them under warranty. They recalled hundreds of thousands of cars, I believe. Anyway, I'm going to go and show you this rack and you can see how bad it is. I've actually already made a video of how to remove one of these steering racks. If you want to see how it all comes apart, you can watch that video here. Now I've taken this steering rack off the car now, and let's get this connector out of the way. You can see the gap there where the motor's actually separated from the actual rack itself. And these are the top two bolts that have just completely sheared off. In fact, what I'll do, I'll just turn this around so you can see it a little bit better. See the gap on this motor? That's the reason why the bloody rack went into limp mode and shut itself down. It's obviously detected too much resistance when the motor's turning. Now I've just turned this bloody rack round, there is actually water dripping out of this motor, just there, that. There's quite a lot of water has actually got inside there. And there's all the water that just come out of this rack. I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to take this last bolt out just so you can see the motor and the little belt drive that actually goes inside there. And this one, I've already had this apart anyway, so it's all going to come off easily. So I'll wedge this out. Here we go. The last bolt. And that there. And you see all you've really got is the ECU bolted onto this motor, and then you've got your little cog piece which actually turns a rubber belt inside the rack, which I'll show you in a minute. So there it is, your little toothed rubber belt that your motor fixes onto and then just drives your gear train in here, all your cogs, to make your steering rack work. But yeah, in most cases, if your motor was to stop working, unless it was to seize up obviously, you'd have a problem. But if your motor was to just stop working, using the steering wheels, you should still be able to steer the rack. But just to finish up here, this motor, this is one of the bolts that snapped off, and it's just absolutely corroded through. In actual fact, these bolts, I think the metal they're made of is just some kind of alley kind of monkey metal. They're pretty soft. You can drill through these bolts quite easily if you've got a good drill bit. I'm actually going to drill these out, and I'll probably fix some proper hardened steel nuts and bolts through it to hold this on, because I know this rack and motor's still okay. It just needs fixing on. It's just going to take me a little time to actually drill them out. And as I had a spare steering rack, I'll just put our spare rack on to get the car back on the road, and I'll try and fix this one up now. But yeah, it can be repaired. But yeah, once these motors bolts break and the motor kind of separates from the rack, it's a lottery whether it's going to do any damage to the motor or not, or whether it's going to destroy this rubber belt. So in a lot of cases, you probably, if this happens to you, you might well end up having to replace the whole steering rack assembly as one unit. And I'll tell you something, if you buy them from Ford, they ain't cheap. Unless of course you can find a good second-hand one. So that's it. What I would suggest, if you own one of these cars, around about the 15 plate, the next time you have it serviced, it's up to you, I would have whoever services it check their motors and just make sure the bolts are at least tight. And well, you're not going to even see, because this isn't a case of the bolts actually coming loose and breaking. It's a case of them actually corroding and breaking. So there's not much you can do about it. But if you have someone check it and there is a broken bolt there, you can catch it before anything more serious happens. Anyway, whatever, it's Christmas. Look at this little lot. Whole bag full of prezzies. Well, we better go and give these to somebody then, better we? I feel like bloody Santa Claus. 1 minute. We've got to look the part. Put the old Santa hat on. Mrs. Monica!
What?
Well, it's Christmas Eve. Problem is, I ain't received my gyro yet, so I'm a little bit short.
Oh gee, thanks.
But don't worry, I've got these for your dog.
Huh, hope he'll be happy.
So that's it. Merry Christmas, everyone.
And Happy New Year.
See ya!